Geoff, welcome to the Decision Making Studio podcast. Pleasure to have you on. This is fabulous. I think we're going to have a really wonderful conversation. So welcome.
Thank you for inviting me, Ben. Looking forward to it.
Before we dive into future fit culture and a whole lot of interesting stuff, it would be useful if you could paint a little bit of a picture for my listeners as to who you are and what you do. And I always say this when I ask this question is take as much time as you would like to answer that. The most interesting people in the world have non-linear, very squiggly career and life trajectories. So please feel free to indulge us in all of that. I'm sure it's fascinating.
Yeah, well, as they say, I started at an early age. I mean, the story actually begins really very young. I mean, I was about 7 years old when I moved to a school in Coventry, which was my hometown where I was born and raised. Although I think probably in Coventry we would say dragged up rather than raised. And the school that I was at from the age of 7 to about 11 was one of the schools that was involved in an experiment in the UK education arena at the time, which following a report done by a woman called Bridget Plowden, so the Plowden report. And this had the stunningly insightful idea that what if we created school environments that served the child rather than saw the child as raw material to be processed by the machinery of the school to spit out what was supposedly the intended form of individual at the end. And so the notion was pupil-centric learning or child-centric learning. And the idea was that it would help the individual to flourish. And certainly that worked with me. In fact, I got to the point where I had covered everything that they could throw at me in the curriculum. And the last few months I was at the school, the headmaster had me helping out in the school library. I think I even helped put some shelves up in the school library, having done a fair bit of DIY already by the age of 11 with my dad. And so that, I guess, helped me pass what was then the matriculation examination called the 11 plus, which decided which senior school you went to from the age of 11 onwards. And in Coventry, there were 2 boys' grammar schools. So we had the grammar school system then in the UK. So I passed my 11 plus and I went to a school called King Henry VIII School, Coventry. And it was called King Henry VIII School because it was founded in 1545 by one of King Henry VIII's ministers. And as you can imagine, a school that was founded in 1545 by one of King Henry VIII's ministers was not particularly pupil-centric. I mean, they were archetypally this idea of, we know what you should turn out like. In fact, I think their mission was something like to create fine Christian gentlemen. So, so I went there and to be honest, I hated it. I mean, I hated the first year or so because it just felt so stifling and constraining. I think often life kind of puts these lessons in front of you that you don't necessarily unpack and realize the significance of until later. And it really was only the last 10 years or so that the penny dropped as to what the significance of that experience was. So I carried on through school at King Henry VIII. I was interested in sciences, and so I did pure mathematics, applied mathematics and physics at A-level. I went to university, did a degree in electronic engineering. I was particularly interested in control theory and systems engineering. So things with feedback loops in. And so the systems thinking connection, which I'm sure comes up on your episodes quite frequently, was already showing its signals at that point. So I did my degree, passed my degree, ended up working at British Aerospace, so military contractor here in the UK, and worked with them for 2 or 3 years after graduation. My degree was a sandwich degree, so I'd actually been sponsored by British Aerospace. Well, they were Hawker Siddeley when I started and became British Aerospace in my first year. So I graduated and worked with them for a couple of years. And then a buddy of mine who I'd been at school and at university with was working in the BBC. He was a radio amateur, so he would spend his evenings up in his loft with his radio talking to people on the other side of the planet. Something that I never really understood why people would do that. But anyway, he was a good guy. And he said to me one day, he said, I just heard that the BBC is about to digitize everything. So this was in about 1981, 82. He said, you're a digital guy. Most of the engineers at the BBC are analog. why don't you come and join us? Because we're about to invest massive amounts of the license payers' money in all this very sexy new digital kit, and you get to play with it all. And it seemed like a really good, interesting thing to do. So I handed in my notice at British Aerospace, worked my 3 months notice period. And then by the time I turned up at the BBC in 82, I think it was, they kindly decided to defer the investment by 2 years. So I turn up a very digital guy into a very analog environment. So that didn't really work out. But they send you off to their training centre at Wood Norton in Gloucestershire. You get trained up on how does TV work, how does radio work. So that was really interesting stuff to me in those days. And I worked with them for about 9 months. It didn't quite work out. And at the time, my sister was a high school physics teacher up in the north of England. And she sent me a cutting from the back of New Scientist, which was for an open innovation lab here in Cambridge that were looking for digital engineers. And so I applied and joined them in April of 83. So as we're recording this, almost 42 years ago. So I was doing digital systems design, control engineering work, worked on a couple of projects, then got asked to manage some projects. Then got promoted to run the digital systems group, or as we used to call it, the drinking systems group. And then from there, I was kind of getting intrigued by the human side of innovation, because I'd experienced how different it was at this place compared to British Aerospace and the BBC. And in fact, that story of my early years at the pupil-centric school from 7 to 11, and then coming to the innovation lab at the tender age of 24 and discovering that I was back in an environment that was very much organized around creating the conditions for the individuals who worked there to flourish. And that was how they stimulated a culture of innovation, agility, adaptiveness, was by creating conditions that help individuals flourish individually and collectively, with the understanding that if they did that, then the business would flourish. And it did, and it continues to. I mean, it's, several hundred people and, much more international. And we did international work in those days, but it now has offices in the Far East and in the States. And so I'd kind of gone full circle through this intervening period of being in this world that was very top-down, command and control, hierarchical, back into an environment that was much more human-centric and was about creating conditions for flourishing of human beings and, their ability to create value in the world, if you like. So it was there that after a few years of running projects and managing people, I kind of was getting a bit bored with the technology side of things, but was fascinated with the human side of things. Like, why is it that when you recruit someone to your group, you can look at two people's CVs or bios and they look on paper to be very similar, and yet you hire both of them, and one of them turns out to be 10 times more a team player, 10 times more client focused, 10 times more innovative. And I was really curious about what was going on there. And particularly, like, you play with technology and you have the same starting conditions on day one. You do the same things with the technology with the same starting conditions on day two. It behaves the same way. The same person on 2 different days can behave quite differently. So I was really curious about what is it that creates the conditions in which people are able to behave in ways that are much more like the innovation lab and a lot less like the top-down hierarchical command and control. So that question was in my mind. And one of our long-standing clients at the time, a Swedish company in the pulp and paper business, happened to say to me one day, he said, "Geoff, we like working with your people. In fact, we like working with your people a lot more than our people. You couldn't come and help make our people behave more like your people, could you?" And so because it was a long-standing client, because they knew what our fee rates were, there was no come up with a proposal, show me your model and your theory of culture change or anything like that. And it was a case of just come and see what you can do. And that was a perfect entry for me into what then has become my career path ever since, which is creating organizational cultures that are, and I use this short form, future fit, because we're living in a world where the future is increasingly uncertain and unpredictable. And as a consequence, we need cultures where people can innovate and can be adaptive and can be agile. And I don't mean apply agile ideas from the software engineering and environment and try and sort of force people to do scrums and hope that suddenly makes them behave in ways that exhibit more agility and adaptiveness. So that's really how I got into doing what I've been doing now for a long time. And at the time as well, the Innovation Lab was owned back in the 90s by a management consulting firm called Arthur D. Little, who always like to pride themselves on being the first management consulting firm, having been founded in 1876, I think it was, 1886 maybe, by Arthur D. Hon Little in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And the connection there was that they had a practice called Technology and Innovation Management. And so there was a set of people whose job was helping client organizations ensure that they've got access to the technologies that they needed, had technology roadmaps, had the right kind of access to what they would see as the technologies they might need in the future. So one of the big clients at the time was Philips. Well, these days they're medical devices, but back then they did a whole range of consumer electronics, including things like CD Walkman, which those of us are old enough to remember the days before digital audio or before, devices that use MP3 format. So Philips would need to kind of like, well, if we're producing these devices, then we need to have access to laser technology for the lasers that read the disk. Now, do we have a lab in the company that does that? Do we form a partnership with a university that has a laser physics laboratory? And so these questions of strategy for technology and what do we do in-house and what do we partner and all of that was the bread and butter work of these consultants. But he was also aware that we had this innovation lab here in Cambridge. And he was also aware that strange people like myself were doing work in and around culture at the soft human side of innovation. And so I got pulled into a whole range of assignments with ADL clients around the world, which was great because it basically fed the pipeline for me doing something that was quite unusual for the organization. Most of the people in the innovation lab were actually doing hands-on tech, as I had been doing. Very few were doing anything like I was. And so the guy who ran that practice, a Belgian guy, Jean-Philippe Deschamps, involved me in lots and lots of assignments. And so that was I was sort of a bit of a strange individual doing those things until 1995. And in 1995, a small consultancy called Innovation Associates, which had been started by three individuals, Charlie Kiefer, Joel Janowitz, and someone that you'll have heard of, Peter Senge, were looking to get acquired by a consulting firm that would give them more global reach because they were a little bit stuck again in the Boston area. Joel was based in San Francisco, but they're basically a little office in San Francisco, the main office in the Boston, Cambridge, Massachusetts area. And how do we get access to a wider global client base? But they didn't want to get acquired by one of the big consulting firms like, McKinsey, Boston Consulting, Bain, etc., because they realized that they would thoroughly destroy the culture. And so they were very keen to get acquired by a company that didn't seem to have a very rectilinear culture, want of a better expression. And in fact, that was typified by the CEO of Arthur D. Little at the time, who said, a lot of people look at Arthur D. Little and think that we are a consulting company with 3,500 consultants. When you're CEO, you realize that we're actually 3,500 consultancies of one person each. So everybody was basically mostly doing their own thing. So that was wonderful for me because it meant that what I was doing, which was sort of in the organizational learning innovation space, suddenly we've got the global leading company doing innovation consulting work, learning organization consulting work as a central part of our operation. And so I ended up working with, and in fact ended up running the team within that unit. And so that kind of, again, reinforced the whole career path I was on. I was then no longer a lone ranger. I was doing it with a group of other people. And that stayed the case until 2001. In 2001, ADL got itself into some financial difficulty for various reasons, and that resulted in a bit of an internal coup. The people who took over running the show sort of looked at firms like McKinsey and Boston Consulting and said, we want some of that finders, minders, grinders, hierarchical, machine-like consulting where you can churn out dollars and all of that. And so those of us who were more interested in really creating organizations that bring people to life and therefore innovation and agility and adaptiveness to life, we all sort of left and went off and did our own thing. So I've been running my own small consultancy, again, based here in Cambridge since 2001. and that's been going now for, I suppose it's the 24th year this year.
This
And
is
you did say
really,
take as long as you like, so that's
yeah, absolutely. No, this is good. This is really interesting on a variety of levels. And I do want to delve into what you mean by future fit culture.
mm,
And the reason why I say that, my own path has sort of gotten me to the point where the world as we know is more complex, more uncertain, more, all of those things.
mm,
And I've had my stints with very top down hierarchical cultures. A lot of my listeners, I'm sure, have as well. And increasingly that doesn't work, right? So the world is it's non-deterministic. It's non-linear. So it's impossible. It's almost absurd to think that a leadership team could have all the answers and be able to push stuff down to the rest of
mm,
the organization. It's quite absurd. And increasingly, my view of this is that organizations that continue to play that game aren't going to be very successful.
mm,
And I'm wondering if we could dive into this term, future fit culture. What is that? What do you mean
mm,
by that? What is that? And what you describe sounds, in terms of how you like to work, it sounds like what we need now, like arguably more than ever. That might be some bias on my part in terms of the present bias and various other things, but it does feel like this sort of top down superstar CEO stuff is
mm.
being called out. Hopefully, is being called out more than perhaps it was in the past. I'm not sure, but
Yeah.
I'm keen to hear your thoughts on that. But anyway, what's a future fit culture?
Yeah, well, I mean, let me lead into that by saying, about 30 years ago, when we were all doing the organizational learning stuff, and, we'd acquired Senge's company, and we were working with the guys who were doing all that work, and, wrote the books, The Fifth Discipline Field Book, The Dance of Change. We were all pretty convinced that we were on the cusp of a massive transformation of the corporate
Mm,
landscape. We just felt like everybody needed to do this. I mean, it was all over Harvard Business Review. Folks like Arie de Geus had written, The Living Company, and he used to be head of group planning at Shell. So the whole zeitgeist was really felt like it was all shifting. And yet, if you
mhm,
fast forward to today, when you look back at that, you say, well, what was the real impact of the whole learning organization movement? In our more cynical moments, those of us who've been on that journey ever since it started would say that the biggest impact you can see in most corporate environments was that the training and development department is now called the learning and development department.
mm,
But what they do is basically the same as what they were doing when they were
mm,
called training and development. So what is it? Well, why is it that doesn't work? Why is it that learning hasn't become embedded deeply in the very
mm,
fabric of organizations? And as you said, the idea that the recognition that the world is becoming increasingly and continues to become increasingly uncertain and unpredictable. I mean, the US Army War College were talking about VUCA in 1989, so
yeah, this
we're
is
like,
not new. Yeah, this is not
35
new
years
stuff.
on.
Yeah.
We're 35 years on from that. Um, why is it that this hasn't changed? And I think it comes down to some quite deeply rooted legacy psychology in organizations that ties into, I guess, the very reason that you have a podcast on decision making. Right. So if I unpack this a little bit and then say I can weave in why I call it future fit culture. So one of the things that Senge, of all the work that Peter Senge did with the Fifth Discipline and all of that stuff that was
And for
very much,
maybe my younger listeners,
yeah.
so what is the fifth discipline? What,
Okay.
if you
So
just in quick, just quick, so we
yeah.
we know what we're talking about.
So the Fifth Discipline was a book that Peter Senge authored in 1990. Harvard Business Review described it as one of the seminal management books of the previous 75 years. And in it, he was laying out an approach to creating organizations that have learning at the core of their
Mhm.
way of being. And he argued that there were 5 disciplines that they needed in order to be able to do this. And so one was personal mastery. So individuals who are getting better at becoming skilled at doing what they really flourished at doing. team learning, so it was the ability to learn collectively with others, mental models. So recognizing that a lot of what goes on in organization goes on because of things that people have got embedded in their consciousness that is not necessarily articulated explicitly. Should have mugged up on them, actually. The fourth discipline. What's the fourth discipline? Can you remember? Anyway, you'll quickly Google it while we're talking about it. But anyway, the fifth discipline was systems thinking. And the idea was that without systems thinking to integrate all of these other
shared vision. Sorry, shared vision was
vision. Okay, yeah. So, and I mean, and shared vision is an interesting one because in those days we still laboured under the, I would say, delusion. Perhaps if I was being polite, I'd say misapprehension that it's possible for senior executives to foresee the future far enough to be able to say, in 5 years' time, we're going to be doing X, and no one can see around the corner. I mean, any organisation that had a strategic plan at the beginning of 2020, by the time COVID hit, like, what was that paper all about? So, I mean, I think it still has a relevant shared vision in the sense of shared vision for how do we want to be together? How do we want to create value together in terms of our culture? So I think that's important. And then the fifth discipline was systems thinking, which, it's an absolute minefield for anybody. I mean, I'd certainly suggest any of the younger listeners and viewers, just be wary about getting yourself drawn into the vortex, which is, my systems thinking technique is better than your systems thinking technique and somebody else's complexity technique. And there is actually a lot of, I actually coined the term episting contests, where people are basically showing off how their clever model is cleverer than the other person's clever model. And so when Senge is talking about systems thinking, he's basically talking about system dynamics, which is a particular school within the broad sweep of theories that get hoovered up into this body of practice and knowledge known as systems thinking. And in fact, if you want the broader overview, the best place to go for that is Mike Jackson's work on the understanding of different schools of systems thinking. So I think his main book was The Systems Thinking and the Management of Complexity. And he was former head of the Centre for Systems Studies at Hull University, now retired, but does a very good job of looking across the whole sweep of about 7 or 8 of the main schools of systems thinking. So that's the fifth discipline book was the thing that got everybody excited because, at the time, organizations were battling with the fact that Japan had gone from being the loser in World War II to becoming the world's second largest economy. It was the Japanese miracle. Western companies, particularly in North America, were like, what the hell's going on here? How come these guys are eating our breakfast, lunch and dinner, taking over the TV industry, the white goods industry, and eroding into the automotive industry? So everybody was interested in how do you go about creating the kind of culture that seems to exist in these organizations that embed more innovation and et cetera in their way of being. And so out of all of that and the subsequent work, the fifth discipline book itself was 1990. Then in 1994, the team brought out a book, which was just before the acquisition by ADL, brought out a book called the Fifth Discipline Field Book, which was like a whole pack of techniques and methods for how do you get those 5 disciplines to come to life in the organization. And then in 1999, they wrote a book called The Dance of Change, which was about the experience of the previous decade of trying to do this in organizations and what challenges did you run into and how did you do this? And they deliberately chose the term The Dance of Change because there's a sort of a to and fro with the almost like with the in-breath and out-breath of the organization that you're trying to work with as you create a new culture. But the reason I mention it is that in that third book is what I think for me is the single most insightful and most profound contribution that Senge made in all of the body of work that he did around this topic. And it's his definition of leadership. And it's on, I think, page 19 of the third book. And in it, he says, leadership is the capacity of a human community to shape its future. Leadership is the capacity of a human community to shape its future. And if you take that as a working definition and experiment with it, and you ask yourself, okay, if leadership is the capacity of a human community to shape its future, how much of the leadership capacity of most organizations gets unlocked and brought online such that that organization is maximally able to shape its future in the way it wants to? And you'd have to admit the answer is probably not very much.
Right.
And part of the reason for that is because the way we designed organizations and the way we have operated organizations for over 100 years now, in fact, it's probably 200 to 300 years. You could probably go back to the Enlightenment, 1685, 1815 kind of period. But really, it was entrenched in philosophy with the publication of what is the Bible of scientific management, called Scientific Management by Frederick Winslow Taylor in 1911. And so this was the idea that the job of senior executives is to make the decisions, and the job of everybody else is to do what the bloody hell they're told. They're the hands, and the brains are the people in the executive suite in the corner offices with the deep pile and wearing the big hats. Now, that has become so deeply ingrained in the psyche of the way organizations work that we take the words decision maker and we take the words senior executive and we think they mean exactly the same thing. And this is the reason why organizations don't have innovation, agility, adaptiveness, and learning, is because if you look at what an organization needs to do, no matter who it is or where it is, if it's going to shape its future, how well it shapes its future depends on how and how well it does three things. How and how well it does sense making. So making sense of itself, its context, how that's changing, how we create value, who we create value for, all of that stuff. How and how well we make decisions, and how well we take actions. And a fourth dimension, super important, is how and how well sense making, decision making, and action taking are connected and iterated. So when the world is fairly slow and fairly stable and fairly predictable, you can get away with senior people doing decision making in their corner offices, coming up with a strategy, hiring a strategy consulting firm to help them predict where the trends are going to be, do some sort of PESTLE analysis, what's going on politically, economically, science, technology, etc. They can do some scenario planning, if there's some unpredictability, they can do all of that kind of stuff. But effectively what it's doing is it's saying a few people in senior positions get to make the decisions about the shape of the organization. They design the organizational machine, you put the pieces together. And ultimately, when you get down to the individual level, the individuals are cogs that are put into the machine to do particular functions, and they're measured on how well they do those functions. That's why we have job descriptions, standardized job descriptions and metrics around individuals.
And annual objectives and stuff like all that stuff.
So if you look at how does that work in practice, so one of the little exercises I do with people, it's my favorite exercise, is I say to people, whereabouts does the decision-making happen in your organization? And they all point upwards. And so whereabouts does the action taking happen in your organization? And they all point downwards, to the coal face, to where the rubber meets the road, to the front line. And then you say to them, where does the sense making happen? And they look at you blankly because they don't really think about sense making as a separate activity. But you explore with them and you have some conversations with them. And very soon they kind of realize, well, you know what? The richest sense making in the organization is going on alongside the action taking. Because that's where people are in contact with customers. It's where they're doing the value creation work and they're running into problems and roadblocks and they're doing workarounds and they're doing that thing that they have to do because the guy in accounts requires this piece of paper and unless he gets it, he won't sign off and all of that stuff. And it's also where you get the biggest diversity of perspective. And if you want innovation, I know the world has kind of gone a bit DEI mad and a bit DEI averse over the last few years, but you don't get innovation unless you've got diverse perspectives. You don't get innovation if you've got diverse perspectives and you don't have any inclusivity in your culture that encourages people to share their diverse perspectives with each other in ways that co-create new value. So what you find then is when people realize that the sense making is happening alongside the action taking, often what happens is the decision making that's happening in the corner offices is so disconnected from that sense making that the decisions that get made when they're handed down to the people who have to take action, those decisions don't make sense. And so the individuals who are asked to take action on decisions that don't make sense, they basically have three options. Option one is even though it doesn't make sense, I'm going to do it because otherwise I'll get told off and I'll get into trouble.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not very motivating, And if you ever wonder why Gallup keeps measuring engagement scores in the
Yeah.
not quite the single digits, but not much above the single
Mm-hmm.
digits,
Mm-hmm.
that's a really good reason. So the second option you have if you're asked to take action on a decision that doesn't make sense is you question the decision.
Mm.
Now, in theory, that's a good thing. But invariably, the senior people who see their job as decision making are so busy doing all the
Yeah.
decisions that they don't want to revisit ones they've already made because that's in the outbox. And so the
Plus,
last thing they want is somebody coming
yeah.
along saying, look, this doesn't make sense. And so effectively, the individual gets told in a polite way or a less polite way, please just do what has been decided. So either they then become one of the people who does what doesn't make sense because they don't want to get fired, or they're demotivated, or if the market is such, they go and find themselves another job or whatever.
Or they get branded a troublemaker or cynic or not a positive person. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The third option you have when you're asked to take action on a decision that doesn't make sense is to do what does make sense instead. But then you have to cover up you did it, because if it gets back to the senior people that you didn't do what you were told, you get into trouble. And so what you have is you have a built-in incentive inside organizations for people who are taking action, the really smart ones, to get together with their buddies at the coffee machine or in the bar or whatever and say, this decision's bonkers. What should we do? And they decide what to do instead. They cover up what they did. So the organization's outcome and results happen despite the decisions that are made at the top, not because of them, but because there isn't this feedback loop, the people at the top assume that the decisions that they made work because they see the results. That's why you don't get any learning in organizations. And that's why 30 years on, we still don't have what we thought we were going to have 30 years ago, which was organizations that have sense-making, decision-making, and action-taking tightly coupled, rapid and repeatedly iterated, deeply embedded, and widely distributed throughout the organization. And so that latter phrase is how I would define a future fit culture. It's one in which sense-making, decision-making, and action-taking are tightly coupled, rapidly and repeatedly iterated, deeply embedded, and widely distributed throughout the organization. And that's the thing that gives an organization the capacity to be able to shape its future in a context which is uncertain and unpredictable. But all the ways organizations think of themselves in terms of how they organize and how they structure and how they run and how they improve are predicated on the idea that what we're doing is we're trying to build a machine for producing dollars, not a human community for creating value in the world in all of its form, including some dollars, because we need some dollars too.
While you were talking about that as well, I was just also thinking about the decision, the myth even that the decisions are made at the top, because even there, I think that there are huge numbers. Well, there's a principal constraint, which is this optimization of short-term shareholder value that negates, you can look at executives' objectives and they'll have, their financial objectives, and then they'll have other stuff related to, could be diversity and inclusion or something around sustainability or something around customer satisfaction or what have you. But if that first objective of beating the numbers isn't met, all the rest of them don't really matter. And it's not just shareholder value, it's this short-term shareholder value, because what's a shareholder is there are lots of shareholders, right? Some have a long-term vested interest in a company, some are short-term, so there's more hot money. And so you get this sort of average fictional kind of shareholder who cares all about the short-term numbers, and everything just revolves around that. So even senior executive, your definition of leadership is supremely constrained by this as a main structural factor. We're talking about a publicly listed company as well.
So I mean, to illustrate your point, I mean, one of the high-tech firms here in Cambridge that has done the best, all the high-tech firms, is a company called ARM. Stands for Advanced Risk Machines, but effectively what they do is they design all of the chips that go into our mobile devices. So they produce all of the chip designs that then get manufactured, usually in Taiwan by TMSC, and then put into chips that we'll then have in our phones. And what you see if you go into an organization like that, and the last time I was inside them was probably 8 or 10 years ago, so it may have changed, but what you would notice is a kind of Jekyll and Hyde culture. So the Dr. Jekyll of innovation and agility and adaptiveness would be there for 2 months of the quarter. And then at the point at which they're about 3 weeks away from the reporting date, everything becomes about hitting your numbers. And so this innovative, collegiate, adaptive culture sort of goes on the back burner whilst everybody scurries around like mad trying to do things to shovel in sales or whatever it is to hit the targets.
Mm-hmm.
And then when everyone's reported and the numbers have gone off to the stock market and to the investors, so the next week everybody's just basically collapsed from trying to hit the targets. And then after that last week, they're back into 2 months of being innovative, agile, and adaptive. So there is a massive influence of the market. And, somebody I mentioned earlier, Arie de Geus, who was the head of group planning at Shell, wrote the book, the Living Company, and was really the figurehead behind the organisational learning movement. I mean, Peter Senge was the person everybody knows, but Arie was the guy who went to MIT looking for someone to look at why is it that organisations that survive over very long periods, what is it they do and how do they adapt? So he was actually the person that got Peter Senge started on the whole organisational learning track. And he was still writing a poem. He passed away a few years ago, but he was still working on papers around what governance needs to look like in marketplaces in order to sustain innovation. Because we still have systems in place that assume that capital is the scarce commodity and that therefore drive everything around stock price and quarterly performance figures. Which, if what you're doing is running a lot of steel mills or whatever, is there's a logic to that. But if what you're doing is you're doing knowledge work, which we've now been doing probably for 30, 40 years as the primary driver of the economy, then all of those external systems are inimical to creating the conditions for it to happen. So the best you can do within that context is for organizations to recognize that that's a constraint and be able to do what they can to buffer and to work their way around. I mean, some people take their companies, you can't do this with major corporations, but some people take their companies into private ownership simply to get away from this ridiculous need to satisfy a bunch of numbers who only care what the numbers are. And have got no vision as to what you're investing in now and what that might be worth in 5 to 10 years' time in terms of your capability to innovate. Because they're ready to jump ship in the next quarter if they don't think your vehicle is going to make more. And that's, again, why the market is so susceptible to the Elizabeth Holmeses and the, the guy, what's his name, Sam Bankman-Fried. And there's another one of the papers at the moment who managed to scam one of the investment banks out of 170 million by promising them some amazing return. And, so this is all part of the same integrated system. But the problem we have is that that's so deeply embedded and so many things are linked to that. Government forecasts of growth and profitability and GDP and everything has become so tightly woven in that it locks this idea of everything being machinery deeply into the fabric, and it makes it very difficult to get away from that. And on a very practical level, if you do the kind of work that I've been doing the last 30, 40 years, what you find is if you do the work that I do in one bit of an organization, the worst thing you can do is be really successful, because what happens is it changes the culture in that bit of the organization and triggers the immune response in adjacent bits of the organization that kill it off. And the people who got super passionate about being able to create cultures where people and the organization thrive get so disheartened that the organization has killed off this amazing thing that they've created together that they end up leaving and becoming independent coaches, where they're now scrabbling around for work to put food on the table and pay their mortgage. So the organization's immune system is extremely proficient at ejecting what it sees as alien behavior that would otherwise infect the status quo. And all the time, the senior people are saying, we want innovation, we want agility, but they don't want that if it means that there has to be deep change in their behavior. And if you're a senior person, most senior people see their job as making decisions, not as creating the conditions in which good decisions get made and implemented throughout the whole organization.
Yeah.
The people who are at the top, who got there by being good at working the system to get to the top, and we know the statistics, the percentages of those people who are sociopaths, and smaller percentage, but some who are psychopaths, more biased towards those roles than across society as a general distribution. Why would those people want to change the culture to one in which their job stops being what they're good at to being something that they probably have no feel for whatsoever?
Yeah.
Which is creating a thriving culture in which the community as a whole gets to shape its future. And they don't stand out as the one supreme personality who is paid 250 times the average salary of the person in the organization. So you can see some of the challenges that we face as a society to shift this, because you can have all the theory you like, but in practice, it comes down to the human psychology of it. And if a senior person thinks that you're undermining them because you're treading on their decision-making turf, then you're going to get in trouble.
Yeah, it's a depressing picture, Geoff, that we're painting. Have you read Dan Davies' The Unaccountability Machine?
Yeah, I have, and I liked a lot of what he said in it.
Yeah.
My one critique would be it's still based on the idea of designing a machine.
Okay.
And I think it's so hard to get away from, the reason I came back to Senge's definition of leadership as the capacity of a community to shape its future is it's always struck me that was almost like an overarching way of thinking about leadership. And then asking these questions about, and then looking at sense making, decision making, action taking. Yeah. And in fact, that story that I tell about it, as the senior people make decisions that don't make sense. When I tell that in an organization, if I'm talking to people who are in the body of the organization, they immediately look at me and they say, "Who have you been talking to?"
Right.
Because they think it's only happening in their organization, because they think every other organization is well run.
Yes.
If I tell that same story to the senior executives, I always get this response. "That's really interesting, Geoff. I'm sure that happens in some organizations, but it doesn't happen here."
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
So there is this insulation that people erect around themselves that stop them becoming to the realization of what needs to change. And so the thing with Senge's thing, last time I saw him was a couple of years ago. He was doing a lecture actually at the Systems Centre in Hull, the Mike Jackson lecture. And we met up and we were catching up, and I realized I'd never asked him where did that definition come from. And so I asked him, I said, where did your definition that leadership is the capacity of a human community to shape its future, where did that come from? And I was expecting him to say, well, I kind of, Nietzsche had said this, and then there was this work here, and then Chris Argyris, and he looked at me and he said, it just seemed obvious. And I felt really disappointed with that answer for about 6 months afterwards. And then one day it dawned on me why it seemed obvious to him was because that's the worldview he lives in. And that made me realize, that's everything I've ever seen him do, and how he is in the world. His being, his seeing, and his doing, and his thinking are all consistent with this understanding that is what leadership is. It's all about the community. It's all about how do you unlock that community capacity, which is why it was all about learning. And it made me realize that the people like myself who come into organizations with this recognition that what you're looking at is something which is, how is the sense-making, decision-making, and action-taking working? And where is it not working? Not everybody's looking at the organization that way. And you have to be able to translate into their language. Because as one of my former colleagues, now retired, used to say, you've got to speak into people's listening. It's no good talking to them about the epistemology and ontology and semiotics of your wonderful model. You've got to be able to talk to them in a way where they see, that means I need to do this differently. And I can see what I can do differently. And I have the capacity to do that. Not I have to go and do a PhD in all of this highfalutin language, and then maybe I might. And again, that's part of the problem we have with these episting contests of people wanting to make their name for their model. And ultimately, they don't really care whether organizations benefit and the world benefits and we're able to create new value. What they care about is that their model sells for them, and whether it's their courses or their books or their speaking engagements or whatever. So there's a lot of that. Now, the people who are really good at creating cultures of innovation, agility, and adaptiveness, future fit cultures, the catalysts who make that happen, are the people in organizations who look and say, well, I've got two options here. I can either do what others do and climb the greasy pole, where I use the organization as a vehicle for me to get on in my career.
Mm-hmm.
Or I can do what I really believe in, which is to create something where collectively we're able to do amazing stuff that we really value. And in every organization, you find people who fit into those two camps. And unfortunately, the organizational ethos that we have today rewards the people who see the organization as a means to their personal ends. And we devalue the people who care enough about the organization to say, you know what, even if it costs me in my career, even if it costs me in terms of my revenue generation capacity as an individual, my salary prospects, I would much rather spend my life doing something which is about creating something that matters, that's meaningful, and that creates conditions in which people flourish individually and collectively, because I like to feel that I'm doing something of value in the world. And I think that that's kind of where things have to shift if we're going to get out of the mess that we're in as a species, as we accelerate towards the end of the, to the edge of the cliff or the brick wall of a metaphor.
I do want to talk about that, because after laying out, the part of the problem and a lot of the constraints, I want to explore things that anyone who's listening to this might be able to start to think about doing, but also, how do we start to chip away at this, or does it require a much larger scale transformation in order to make a necessary shift? Because it seems like this is not sustainable when you think about what's happening in the world, whether that's the climate, or increasingly organizations are kind of, it seems like, creaking at the scene. Like, people are dissatisfied about mental health crisis, societal polarizing. There are things that just don't seem like this stuff is sustainable when you start to put it all together. Or maybe I'm being overly pessimistic. Income inequality is grown over the last, the period that we've been talking about. For example, standards of living that younger generations will have, that they're not going to be commensurate with, with those who are of an older generation. There's just a lot that doesn't seem to be. It's just not working. And conversely, we do have these movements of sustainability and ESG and things like that, but those seem to be shifting back into the same top-down, formulaic, deterministic way of running the show, operationalizing stuff that actually you can't really operationalize because it's just too uncertain, too volatile, too complex. So there's a lot there. I know you have these sort of 5 habits of, I forget what you call them exactly, 5 fatal habits.
Well, the 5 fatal habits are symptoms of the situation that we're in, in terms of the way in which we've thought about organizations for a very long time. And therefore, if you go into organizations and say, well, okay, well, if you're trying to create innovation, agility, adaptiveness, or learning, or whatever, what, do you have these habits in place? And so the 5 are, one, best way thinking, which is, okay, we've got to work out what the best way is to proceed. I mean, this is incessant sense making. We're sense making, and then we're doing some more sense making, then we're doing another study. You look at the incoming government in the UK, right? We've got problems with social care. So we've been talking about the problems with social care for the last 15 or 20 years. And now the government's come in and said, we're going to do a study and it's not going to report until 2028. That's 3 years' time. It's like we're doing sense making so that we can do sense making. And back in the Innovation Associates days, they used to have this thing which they referred to as fixing to get ready to begin. So this is what happens with One Best Way. It's like, before we press the go button to actually do anything, we've got to work out what's the best way that everybody agrees is the best way, so that we don't make any mistakes, right? And it's predicated on we've got to design the machine. If you're going to design the machine, you better make sure the design's right before you actually start to drill metal and weld metal and put connections together.
It's madness. It's sort of like we can come up with the answer by studying it beforehand, rather than observing the actions that we take, experimenting and seeing what we learn along the way.
Exactly. And that's the latter thing is the essence of iterative sense-making, decision-making, action-taking, what you're doing is you're making enough sense to make some decisions about what action to take on the basis that you've got the sense that that action possibly is moving in the right direction, but more importantly, will flush out more real sense making from the real world that will enable you to make a better decision on the next iteration. So if you embed that capacity to do sense making, decision making, and action taking in the fabric of the organization, what happens is people are constantly trying things out, seeing what works, scaling what does, winding down what doesn't. This is why the companies that at the moment are in the multi-trillion-dollar valuations are there. That's what they're doing. They're experimenting all the time. They're doing A/B split testing on you. You and I go to Google and we ask it a question and it gives us slightly different answers and sees how we respond. And so they then modify the algorithms in order to adapt to what works and what doesn't. And so this is why these organizations are doing extremely well. The ones who are going away to do a 3-year study to decide something that people have been studying for the last 15 or 20 years, what they're doing is they're just buying themselves time to not get a bollocking for the fact that the actions that they take don't work. And all the time, the people who are in the body of those organizations can see what needs to be done, but they're not given any power and influence to do it because somebody in government is basically, or somebody at governance level, or somebody in the C-suite is going to be upset if they take an action and it looks like the person at C-suite didn't know what it was, whatever. So that, I mean, all of these 5 habits, they stem from that thinking. So one best way, so the second habit is all or nothing thinking. So we've got to plan it out, soup to nuts before we even start. You know, the third habit is leadership that creates followers. So this is senior people whose job is to make the decisions and other people's job is to say, yes, sir, no, sir, 3 bags full, sir, and do what they're told rather than unleash the collective capacity of the community to shape its future. You know, this is the John Cotter view of leadership, the 8-step, come up with a coalition and a plan and a vision and all that nonsense. You know, even when he wrote the book in 96 and when he published the sequel or the update to it in, I think it was 2010, something like that. In the foreword of the book, he said, you know, we have to involve more people in this iterative way of being. You know, more people in a more iterative way is required. But the whole fucking book was still about how do you do a, top down.
It's top down, right? So just this is the cycle of like how to make change, how to do change management, right? So
so it's how to do change when what you're doing is you're assuming that you've got a machine that you've got to periodically redesign, as opposed to a human community that's got to be able to adapt itself to its changing environment on an ongoing basis, on a day-to-day basis.
Now, I could be mistaken here, but doesn't some of it map to the stages of grief as well? The change acceptance is.
Well, I mean, again, the Kubler grief cycle is something some people believe in and some people don't. Just like some people believe that we've got generational cohorts, and some people don't. I mean, at the end of the day, you've got human beings in an organization, and if what you do is you get them at the individual level to have the attitude. I don't see the whole picture, but what I see is important and relevant. Let me talk to Ben and see what he sees, because he's going to be seeing some aspect of reality that I don't, because none of us sees the whole 3D reality. None of us has the God's eye perspective, but we each have a valid 2D perspective. And if we can bring those together and be curious about each other's perspectives, then what happens is we not only enrich our own perspectives, but we actually build collaboration and psychological safety. And in psychological safety, for those who are listening, I've got my psychological safety shaker out here, which you sprinkle liberally over the organization in order to get, I mean, that's what people think of in psychological safety. Psychological safety is an emergent property of a culture of innovation, agility, and adaptiveness. So if you want it, you need learning. In fact, originally, what's her name?
Edmondson.
Yeah, Amy Edmondson. She used to do, I don't know if she still does it, but she used to have a 2x2 grid, and on one axis it was learning, and on the other axis it was performance, and then the top right quadrant, which is always the one you want in a 2x2, was psychological safety. So let me just finish the other two. The 5. Okay, so we got through one best way thinking, all or nothing thinking, leadership that creates followers. The fourth one is wasting people's strengths. And this is what we do, is we take human beings who are all unique and all have different strengths,
Mhm.
And what we do is we say, well, actually, here's the job description. Here's the shape of cog we would like you to be. And you're really good at this thing over here. So we're not bothered about that because you already meet the requirement. But on this thing that you're crap at and you hate doing, we're going to put you through a remedial program so that you get better at this thing that you're not very
Yeah.
good at and you're not
Yeah.
interested in, even though somebody that you work with is brilliant at that, but we've told them not to do as much of that because they don't fit their job profile. And Peter Drucker, who was like the
Mhm.
ultimate guru
Mhm.
of organization, philosophy, leadership, management for donkey's years. If you ever asked him towards the end of his life, David Cooper Ryder asked him this and said, what's the essence of everything that you've learned? And Drucker
Mhm.
said, that's easy. We have to create organizational conditions in which we play to our strengths in such a way that our weaknesses become irrelevant. So what you have to do is you have to create the conditions in which people work well together as they are as human beings. What
Mhm.
you don't do is say, we don't really care too much about what you're really good at because we've got a job description for you. And why have we got a job description? Because we think this is a machine. And so we have to
Mhm.
design the parts and you're the part that fits into this
Yeah.
particular
It's
area.
it's madness. It's kind of
So
like
it's
saying,
absolute bonkers, and then you say you
yeah,
want
it,
innovation when you've told people just do this thing here, and we're going to mark you down on this
yeah,
distribution that kicks out the bottom
yeah.
10% because some nutcase once in Intel thought that was a good idea. What?
It's also kind of like saying, you have Lionel Messi in your football team, and you're saying, well, you're not that good with your right foot. So go and train your right foot. We're not going to start. You're not going to play you until you kind of your right foot becomes as good as your left foot, and then
Yeah,
then everything or whatever. Simone Biles is in your team, and you don't get her to do gymnastics. You get her to do swimming
yeah,
until she's it's madness. It's madness.
yeah, yeah. And so you've got these. So the 4 fatal habits that we've done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One best way thinking, all or nothing
Yep.
thinking, leadership
Yep.
that creates followers, wasting people's strengths. And the fifth
Yep.
one.
Yep.
And,
I want to get
it's
into
always
this
the
one.
fifth one. The fifth
Yeah.
one is always like the fifth discipline. It's always the one that bolts all the
Yeah.
others
Yeah.
together. The
Uh-huh.
fifth
Uh-huh.
one is the hired help that hinders because you
Yeah.
hire in McKinsey, Boston Consulting, BCG, Accenture,
Mm-hmm.
KPMG, whoever
Mm-hmm.
it
Mm-hmm.
is.
Mm-hmm.
And what do? They tell you, you need to find the one best way. You need all or nothing. Your leadership needs to get the
Mm-hmm.
followers. You need to fit
Mm-hmm.
people into these things that we've designed. And so
Mm-hmm.
what you have is you have a system, the $1 trillion consulting um, parasitic entity that's out there that, according to Mariana Mazzucato and Rosie Collington
Uh,
in their book, The Big Con,
yeah.
I've got it down here, weakens our
Mm-hmm.
businesses, infantilizes our governments, and warps our economies. What
Mm-hmm.
you're doing is you're undermining the capacity of the human community to shape its future. Why? Because that's how you suck dollars out in order to pay
Mm-hmm.
partner bonuses. And why do you do that? Well,
Mm-hmm.
because senior executives don't know what they're doing. So they hire big consulting firms to tell them what to do. And the big consulting firms talk to the people in the body of the organization who are doing the sense making.
Yeah.
They suck it
Yeah.
out. They
Yeah.
marshal it and they put it into PowerPoints now using
Yeah.
ChatGPT.
I've done it.
And then
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
use that to tell the senior executives what they should do. And of course,
Mm-hmm.
what they should do is
Mm-hmm.
hire the consulting firm to do the next piece of assignment
Yeah.
all the time,
Yeah.
undermining the people in the organization who know what they need to do, never get the chance to do it because the senior executives are making the decisions because they think their job is decision making, not creating the conditions in which decisions get made and implemented
Mm-hmm.
throughout the body of the organization. I mean, it is
Yeah.
insanity when you lay it out. And yet we all find ourselves drawn into contexts where the default way of doing it is such a massive gravitational pull that it takes real skill and real capability to do anything different. And so we were sort of easing our way, I think, in the conversation a little bit earlier as to what can we do? I mean, it's almost like
Yeah.
it seems like an impossible thing. And so what we don't do is try and redesign the whole system because that's what you do when you think of it as a machine. What you do is you start where you are and you move things
Mm-hmm.
forward. And if you're an individual in an organization, you might think, I don't really have that much power or influence to make things happen. But what you can do is you can be more curious about your colleagues' perspectives and not assume that you already know the answer. And in doing that, you can start to behave in a way that models what I call a 2D, 3D mindset. This is the idea
Okay.
that as an individual, you only ever have a 2D perspective, no matter how brilliant it is. And yes, it can get enriched. And yes, it does get enriched as you work with colleagues who bring complementary perspectives. But by being genuinely curious about what others see that you don't, and not assuming that if they see something different, it means they're an idiot or an arsehole, being curious about what it is they see that you don't see, you can get more insight yourself. But more importantly, at least as importantly, probably more importantly, is they feel that you respect them because you're curious, genuinely curious about their perspective. And that's the thing that starts to create the nuggets of interaction that coalesce into a future fit culture. And it's when people do this together in the organization that they start to say, well, this particular rule that we have, or this particular structure that we have, is stopping us from really creating value. And if they can do that collectively and see how it needs to change, then they have the opportunity of saying, this is the one thing that is stopped. This is the thing that is most restricting, constraining our capacity to create value and our capacity to shape the future. Let's do something to relax that constraint. And then when you do that, people start to see that they can create new value together. They get enthusiastic because it unlocks their capacity to create new value and to shape the future. And so they start to believe that it's possible because they see it in practice. What you don't do is say, don't worry, we've got a new CEO or we've got a new head of strategy. Just wait 3 years and then we'll tell you what the answer is to the social care problem or whatever it might be. And it's just insane, really. So each individual has the capacity to do something. And there are those people in the body of the organization who aspire to make that happen, who I call future fit culture catalysts. You know, they're the ones who, in order to catalyze that change in the organization, not only have to understand it, but also have to have the capacity, the character traits required to be strong at embodying that stance. So they continue to see things in a way that can virally infect the culture of the organization so that it is more innovative, adaptive, and agile. It does take into account other people's perspectives as an integral part of day-to-day work, not as some initiative or some sheep-dip program that HR has sent you on.
Yeah. One of the things that as you were talking is, and I have been I'm a former management consultant, and I have done this sort of, talk to people and find out what's going on. And, but I actually found that to be a really interesting part of the role. But you don't need to be a management consultant to do that. And I think people can do that on their own if they work in a large organization and just start to talk to people. And I think a wonderful question to ask is, why do we do this way? Because one of the most interesting things that I found as a management consultant, you ask that question, you ask a bunch of people, they'll say, well, it's because, this, or talk to these guys, and then and you just go back and you go into a full circle, and no one knows the answer why you do something this way. It's just maybe 10 years ago, someone decided to do something like this. So, okay, so we can change it, right? We don't have to do it like this. There's no good reason. Everyone assumes that there is, but there actually isn't. Yeah. But anyone can do that with maybe a part of the, an organization that they're working in. You don't have to be you don't have to be badged a management consultant to do that. It's not rocket science.
I mean, the challenge for people, I think, is that there are many forces inside organizations that mitigate against them doing this kind of stuff. And I'm sure many of the listeners or viewers now are going, that's all right in theory, but in practice, So I think here, one of the things that I found super useful, and when I was at with the Innovation Associates crew from 95 to 2001, one of the people who I encountered there and worked with was a woman called Joan Langcourt. And Joan had been at MIT Sloan School and had participated in a big study of transformational change in organizations, and had ended up as co-author of a book called Intentional Revolutions, which came out in 96. And in this work, she and a couple of colleagues, Ed Nevis, who ran the department, and Helen Vassallo, who contributed also, they came to the conclusion that successful transformational change in organizations happened when there were 7, I tend to think of them as channels of influence. They called it a 7-point strategy, because back in those days, everybody was still talking, everything was strategy, because that's the big thing. What's a strategy consultant? An expensive consultant. So I think of them as channels of influence. Maybe it reflects the fact that I was at the BBC and studied radio and TV and stuff, and that there are channels transmitting all the time. And so the question is, what do you tune into? And so they said there are these 7 channels through which people pick up the clues and the cues and the signs and the signals from which they infer the way we do things around here, which is a useful shorthand for culture. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
if you talk to people in an organization, you say, what's the culture like? They don't go,
Mm-hmm.
what do you mean by culture? And they don't talk about artifacts and totems and the sorts of things that academics talk about. They
Mm-hmm.
say, well, keep your nose clean, make sure you hit your numbers. And like you were saying earlier, if you're a senior executive, as long as you hit your numbers, then maybe you get to do these other things. But if you don't, then you're in trouble. You're probably not going to be around much longer.
Mm-hmm.
So people are able to articulate these things. So how do we know that? When you're an individual, you join an organization or you move into a different part of an organization, it usually takes you about 3 months to back yourself in and to get your feet under the table or whatever metaphor. But what you're doing is you're picking up various clues, cues, signs and signals throughout the organization. So they identified what they call the 7 channels through which, or the 7 factors, I call them the 7 channels. And so the first one is persuasive communication. So who are the people telling the stories that you find persuasive? Executives try and do this. They grandstand and they say, our strategy is X, Y, Z. And people go, do I really believe that? And they go off to Ben, who's always got his ear to the ground, and say, Ben, do you believe this? And you go, no, it's just, don't worry. It'll go away. It'll be gone in 6 months' time. The next one will be along. Okay, right. I'll just pretend then. Yes, boss, definitely. And then just carry on doing what I was. Yeah, that's the best strategy. So that's the persuasive communications. That's one channel. Second channel is participation. To what degree, and I think of this, to what degree do people get involved actively in the sense making and the decision making, as opposed to just the action taking? So that's participation. The third channel is role modeling. Who are the role models? Who are the people that when you look round are the ones that you say, those are the people to behave. That behavior is the behavior that gets you on in the organization. Don't do what they're doing over there. I know it says do that in the HR manual, but if you do that, this is what will happen to you. These are the people to follow. This is what to do. So that's role modeling. Fourth channel is the one that's most difficult for people to get their heads around. They call it in the book expectancy, but it's the Pygmalion effect. And this is where people who are influential look at you and they say, that Ben guy, he seems okay, but he's a bit slow on the uptake. And so I'm not going to give him this challenging work because he probably won't do very well at it. And so Ben's demotivated and he doesn't do very well and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if the person takes the opposite view and says, smart guy, clearly switched on, knows what he's doing, I'll give him this challenging task. Ben thinks, well, this is a challenging task, but my boss has got belief in me and he or she seems to think I can do this. So, and you step up to the plate and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so that's the fourth channel. 5, 6, and 7 are ones every organization uses and overuses. 5 is structural rearrangement. So in one case, that's the organogram, but it's any new processes or procedures or rules. Channel 6 is, they called it in the book, extrinsic rewards. Basically, it's carrots. And channel 7 is coercion or sticks. And so all those 7 channels are all playing out in all organizations all the time. Now, what you get, first of all, is misaligned messages coming down the different channels. So the CEO says, we want to be a team-based organization. But actually, you get your extrinsic rewards based on your own personal performance. And so you work out that the optimum way to behave is to grandstand as though you're a team player while making damn sure you undermine the person you're in competition with so that you hit the targets and they don't, and then you get the bonus and you get the promotion. So once you understand the signals that are coming down these channels, you begin to understand why is the behavior the way it is. When if you didn't understand the signals coming down those channels, you would look at individuals behaving in a way that you didn't understand and assume that they were perverse, that there was something wrong with them. And this is attribution bias, where you assume that somebody else's behavior is due to their character defects, whereas your behavior is due to the strange forces that you find yourself under the influence of. So this becomes quite important in understanding where do you get the opportunity to make a difference in an organization, because those signals don't just emanate out of the ether. I mean, they come from certain key influences in the organization. The key thing here is they're not always in the most senior positions. And never, ever in any of the organizations that I and my colleagues, when I work with other colleagues at Arthur D. Little, looked at, did we ever find an organization where all the key influencers were on the top team? And we never found a top team where all the people on the top team were key influencers. And that means you have to do a bit of theatre sometimes because you have to interview them, even though you realize they're not really that influential, because otherwise they'll get upset. And we found one organization, it's the only organization we ever found, and I can talk about this because it's now public domain, where none of the senior executives were key influencers, and that was the BBC. And that's why the BBC continuously has these sexual abuse scandals, starting with Jimmy Savile, and then we've had Philip Schofield, and now we've had Hugh Edwards. And no doubt there's more bubbling away, because in the BBC, the people who have all the power is the on-screen talent, because everybody wants to be close to the on-screen talent. And, you know, when I worked there as an engineer, I can remember going up in the lift in Broadcasting House, and John Humphreys was in the lift with me. And I was like, I felt the glow for 2 days afterwards. This is a guy I've seen on telly. So you start to see what are the influences that really cause people to pick up the clues, cues, signs and signals that tell them this is the way we do things around here. And the BBC, it was really stay close to the important people. And if they're doing something that they really shouldn't be doing, turn a blind eye, because they're really important to us. So our work was actually cited by Dame Janet Smith. We were hired by Greg Dyke, and unfortunately had to fall on his sword partway through. Mark Thompson completed the work as the Director General to look into the culture of the BBC and whether it was aligned with their stated values. And that work was reported in Dame Janet Smith's inquiry into Jimmy Savile. And the soundbite from that is that some people at the BBC were more valuable than the values. Often find this in organisations, that there are certain people, and the way they signal that they're really important is they can violate the supposed values and get away with it, because they're more valuable than the values. And it becomes an incentive for them to test out, am I really that important to the organisation? Because if I can get away with this, it signals that I am. So there's some quite interesting dynamics that you get when you start to play around with organisational culture.
The investment banking world comes to mind, star traders. I think there's loads of that goes on in financial services, the sporting world as well. But
yeah, and then you've got testosterone there as well. I mean, there's a book written by John Coates, who was on the board of the Daedalus Trust when I was on the leadership team there, looking at hubris in leadership. He wrote the book, The Hour Between Dog and Wolf. Dog and Wolf. And like, you know, your testosterone is up, because if you pull off this trade, you're going to be able to buy a house in the Hamptons, cash.
Yeah, it's you know, it's fascinating, but so there are some things that individuals can do within teams or contexts, or leaders can do. It does still feel like it requires a fair bit of bravery, and I always remember something that a colleague mentioned when I mentioned something that I wanted to do that was different, potentially career limiting. He said, "Ooh, that's brave." And it might even be a line in the Yes Minister series. And it, you know, normally you would think being called brave is a compliment, but actually in these contexts, it's not. It's the opposite. You're doing something quite silly career-wise. But what else? Maybe I'm wondering if you mentioned governance, and Peter Senge working on some governance reform things. What are are there other things that we can look at doing to overcome?
Well, I mean, I think to your point about bravery and risk, I think that to a degree that's true, but I think also there is the opportunity there to make a difference. And I think sometimes, you know, I remember when I set up my own business in 2001, a number of my colleagues at the consulting firm said, you know, that's brave. Courageous. And actually I was a bit bemused by that, because it didn't feel like I was drawing on any courage or any bravery. It just seemed to me clarity. I knew I couldn't make myself go and do finders, minders, grinders consulting, which is what I would have to do if I stayed with the firm and the new regime was coming in. I knew what I cared about. I knew that I wanted to help organizations create these kind of cultures, because that's where I got my buzz. Ever since I did a piece of work with another Swedish client where the culture changed overnight, and I was so amazed. The CEO said to me, "How did you do that?" I said, "I wish I knew," because what had happened is people had gone from being at loggerheads with each other, you know, like banging heads, to actually being integrated and moving forward. And we all got like left behind in the slipstream. The CEO, all of us, it was like they were off. These warring factions suddenly were best buddies and making stuff happen. And it took me a long time to unpack and understand what was going on there. And it really was this thing about the different 2D perspectives, you know, the circle and the triangle and the square. For those of you watching, you know, I've got this shape, which is a circle from one angle, is a triangle from another angle, and is a square from another. I mean, if you want to imagine just like a cylinder, if you cut it crossways, it looks like the cross section is a circle. If you cut it vertically, it looks like it's a rectangle. I also have a triangle on this one, but anyway, you'd have to watch the YouTube video of this to be able to see that. Once you realize that what happens so often is people are stuck at the 2D level, and it's like, well, I can say it's a circle and you're saying it's a triangle, and we can't both be right. And I know I am, so you must be wrong. But if you lift up to this higher level and say, hang on, what are you saying that I'm not? Magic starts to happen. That's what happened with this client, and their culture literally changed overnight. And I was blown away because I'd bought into all of this idea that culture change is long-winded and drawn out and inevitably, fails and difficult and stuff. And I'd seen this happen overnight, and I was like just so stoked with what had happened. I'm like, okay, I don't care. I'm going to spend my career doing this because this is amazing. When you see the pent-up human capacity that has been used, like 50.1% of the capacity has been used to move the organization forward, and 49.9% of the organization's capacity is being used to hold it back. So it's moving forward at 0.2 of what it, 0.2%. If you can get that down to 60 moving forward and 40 holding it back, that's 20%. You've gone 100 times as much performance just simply by rebalancing that. And so that was what I'd seen happen. And so once you recognize that that's possible, it creates the enthusiasm to be able to say, actually, this is what I want to spend my time doing. And yes, I'm going to have to learn some skills because I have to learn, how to be, to be in a state, to be empathic. I've got to be able to understand, well, why is the person behaving the way they are? Because the simple knee-jerk assumption is they're an idiot or an arsehole. But what if they're not an idiot? What if they're not an arsehole? What would you have to, how would you have to see the world in order to be behaving the way they are? Of course, you could be curious and go and ask them, or you could ask some of their friends, or you could find out why. And then often you oh my God, I never realized that was what it was like for them. And now you've got the opportunity to make something different. But if people sort of stay remote from each other and just assume, well, we're all working really hard, so it must be those idiots or arseholes over there who are causing the problem. And of course, they're looking back at you thinking exactly the same thing. No wonder organizations stay stuck. And of course, it's a minefield for consulting firms, because then they come in and they do their magic, and the CEO, even if the organization doesn't move forward, the senior executives can claim we've got the consultants in. I mean, this is what will happen with this social care thing, is they'll hire some consulting firm to come in and do the strategy for the next 3 years. And then Wes Streeting and Keir Starmer will say, well, we've got it it's under review. We're working on it. I mean, it won't go anywhere, but it gives you plausible deniability for the fact that you're not doing the job that you're being paid for, which is to create the conditions for success. And I mean, that's always been the role of senior people. Their job has always been create the conditions for success. The way they used to do it was by doing the decision making. Now they have to do it by creating the conditions in which sense making, decision making, and action taking is happening inside the organization. So for the individuals, I would say that believe that you have the possibility of making a difference. Learn some of the skills that you need in order to be able to engage with others where they might be very entrenched in their perspective. They might feel very threatened. They might feel very triggered that you're seemingly questioning their perspective, but learn how to be curious about it rather than going in with the attitude of, I think I found the problem and it's you. If you go in with that feeling, people are very sensitive at picking this sort of stuff up, particularly because they probably know in their heart of hearts, in those dark moments where they wake up at 2 a.m. and they're wondering, am I the problem? You get near that stuff and it's going to be very threatening for them. And so there are skills that you can learn in how to be curious and constructive in your curiosity, such that you open the possibility for people to approach you and to work with you well and be able to do magic together. And once people start to see that they've done something that's felt rather magical, they start to believe that they can do anything. Edwin Land, who was the guy who invented the Polaroid land camera, the story goes that his granddaughter, I think it was, said, "Grandpa, why can't we have the photos immediately?" And, he didn't want to explain to her the complexities of silver nitrate chemistry, and it was wet. She was too young to understand it, and he didn't say, don't be so stupid. But they started working on it, and he said, we had to solve about 5 impossible problems, like how do you get the image onto the paper, but then fix it so that it doesn't fade. And he said, by the time we'd solved the 5th impossible problem, we began to believe we could do anything. And
Mm.
human beings have
Mm.
massive capacity to do things that appear to be incomprehensibly, magically amazing,
Mm.
but we don't normally encounter the experience. And so we don't believe we have. And so we sort of stay safe in our comfort zone, which is usually a discomfort zone because we really don't like what we're doing now, but we can't see a way of moving things forward.
Mm. I love that. I think that's a wonderful place to start to wrap up the conversation, because I think it gives people something to try, something to as you were mentioning, what can I do now? I think it's a very sensible question to ask. I was even thinking about that. I wrote a short piece about uncertainty, and the question "why not" is a really powerful question to just ask and just explore a little bit. And then what you were talking about, sense making, because stuff, you make sense of stuff as you do stuff, and that's also a valuable skill. And
Can
I'm
I,
also
can I
trying to put
offer
myself,
a
yeah,
suggestion in terms
please,
of can I offer a slight twist on why not?
okay,
Because sometimes why not, even when we ask ourselves,
yeah,
invokes a defensive response that says, for all these reasons.
yes,
And I'm somebody who, I took up a meditation practice about 35 years ago. And one of the things that you discover when you try and meditate is that you're shit at meditation. And people give you all sorts of advice on what to do and how to do it. And you're sitting there thinking about meditation. And so you're not getting very far. And you're starting to tell yourself, I can't do this. And so it becomes quite difficult to do something if you're telling yourself you can't do it. And somebody, I can't remember who it was, it's so long ago now, said, what would it be like if you could? And so why not could be a useful question, or it could be, what would it be like if we could? And
mm,
sometimes by doing the thought experiment of what it could be like if we could, you bypass the excuses of why you can't.
mm,
And having stepped into a future that looks more compelling, and this was, again, part of the fifth discipline stuff, was this idea of creative tension. You step into a future vision of
mm,
yourself in a condition where you're thriving and what's going on
mm,
and if you can embody that experience, it can be such a powerful magnetic pull that you start to find ways past what would otherwise have been the obstacles when you didn't have that visceral connection to the potential for the future. And so I think this is a really important thing for any of us as individuals, because if we don't believe things can be better in the future in our heart of hearts, and we don't have a sense of what it would be like, there's no pull towards that better future. And we don't fully engage our capacity for creativity in order to find creative ways of getting there.
mm,
What I found in the innovation lab was the place was just, you could feel that vibe in the atmosphere. You could feel the vibe of the excitement and the belief and the enthusiasm of the potential for doing great things. Solving the problems of British industry through technology was, I think, something of a kind of like a catchphrase, if you like, when the place was founded in 1960. But it felt, you could feel it. If you didn't have to be very long inside the environment before you felt that vibe in the place, and it got you into that mindset and that enthusiasm. And sure, you encounter difficulties and problems, but
mm.
people would have the attitude of, okay, how do we turn this liability into an asset?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful place to wrap things up. Was there anything that you wanted to cover that you don't think we adequately?
I think the only thing I would say that, when we briefly spoke or
Mm,
exchanged message beforehand, and you were, I think you'd asked a question about structure. I think, one of the things with structure is to recognize it's just one of the 7 channels,
mm-hmm,
and that changing a structure, whether it's an organogram or changing a procedure or a
yeah,
process or
yeah,
whatever, it's always that change
yeah.
is always in the context of those other 6 channels.
So
And
I was
often
thinking
it's in an,
more, yeah, with that question, I was thinking more, not the organizational structure, actually the structures around the organization.
oh, I see. Okay.
The societal structures,
Yeah.
the constructs around, whether that's corporate governance or the way that, we design shareholder reporting,
Mm.
raising of capital, all of those kinds of things,
Yeah.
which are linked very much into, the more societal structures, not organizational
Yeah.
structures.
Yeah. And I think that we just have to recognize a lot of it is very, very difficult to shift. And, do there appear to be people out there who have the will to do some of the shifting? I think it's going to be curious and interesting to see what happens in the States. over the next few months, with the Trump 2.0 and, Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency. I mean, there's plenty of potential for it all to go disastrously wrong. And I'm sure most people who are thinking about it assume that that's probably the most likely outcome, and it may well be. But I think that recognizing the scale of change that's required in the context, there is this concept that I think it's Eric Weinstein who coined it, called the DISC, which is the distributed idea suppression complex. And he said, there isn't a kind of a conspiracy out there trying to stop the sorts of things that we're talking about right now. There isn't a cabal of people sitting in a dark room saying, we've got to stop all this innovation, agility, adaptation. It's the integrated nature of all of the systems that are distributed that suppress these ideas and stop them from being able to make a difference. Recognizing that there are constraints, but what can we do within the context that we're in that enables us to make something different? Because it's the difference in actions that has the impact on the world. And, whether it's the story of the person walking on the beach littered with starfish and he's throwing them into the sea, and somebody says to him, look, there's millions of these things on the beach. You can't make a difference to all of them. And he said, no, but I made a difference to that one.
Yeah.
And with each one that he throws or she throws into the sea. So, recognizing there are limitations, but that shouldn't be a reason why we don't do something. And doing something actually makes you feel more agentic.
Yeah.
You feel like you have more agency in the world. And that in itself helps to move things forward.
And change happens in a variety of just look at historically, whether that's, women's right to vote or, a whole range of things where those were driven by movements, and those movements affected change, and so there's a fair bit to learn from that.
And I mean, there's a quote that all the good quotes turn out not to be by the person they're attributed to, but this one is exactly the same, but it was attributed to Victor Hugo. It's a great quote, so I'm going to quote it anyway, which is, there is one thing more powerful than all the armies of the world, and that is an idea whose time has come. And maybe, given the context and maybe the fact that we're facing such dire externalities these days, maybe the time has come.
Geoff, I think that's a wonderful place to wrap things up. Before we go, for my listeners who've enjoyed this and want to connect with you and know a little bit more about your work, what are the best places to do that?
I have a Substack, which I publish on fairly regularly. I have a website, geoffmarlow.com. You just have to make sure you spell Geoff Marlow right, because all the other Geoff Marlows with all the other variants, i.e. Jeff or put an E on the end, they all turn out to be actors for some reason. Actually, I think one's a production director in a company. So that, my Geoff is Geoff and my Marlow is without an E. I'm sure it'll be there in the show notes. But if you do Jeff or Marlow with an E on and you try any of the other three options, you get interesting characters, but they're all actors. I don't know, maybe I'm a bit of a performer myself.
Geoff, thank you very much. Really appreciate you taking the time to chat.
Yeah, it's been enjoyable, very enjoyable. Thank you very much, Ben, for the opportunity.